Hello everyone, tonight we're visiting a place that proves you don't need a war or an asteroid to wipe out a civilization. Sometimes, all it takes is faith, ambition, and a little deforestation. From carving 80-ton ancestors with hand tools, to chopping down the last palm tree while chanting prayers for abundance, to building a new religion around a single bird egg, the story of Easter Island is equal parts genius, devotion, and slow-motion disaster. Take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy stories about humanity's more creative mistakes. And tell me in the comments, where are you tuning in from, and what time is it for you right now? I love knowing where these strange little journeys find you. Now, lower the lights, maybe pour some tea, or just listen to that quiet hum in the background. Let's sink into the silence of Rapa Nui, where stone giants still stand watch over an island that once believed eternity could be carved by hand. Let me tell you about the person you could have been, not the version of you that orders overpriced lattes and complains about the Wi-Fi, but the one who, 800 years ago, stepped out of a double-hulled canoe after weeks of rowing into nothingness. You've got salt crusted on your skin, your hair's glued into sea ropes, and you've just landed on a speck of volcanic rock in the middle of nowhere. Congratulations, you found Rapa Nui, the most isolated inhabited place on Earth. No rescue boats, no trade routes, no plan B, just you, your family, and a horizon that never changes. You didn't exactly plan this as a weekend getaway. You came because someone in your lineage looked at the endless Pacific and said, there must be something out there. A line that in any sane world should have been followed by, let's not find out. But this was Polynesia, home of people who sailed by starlight, ocean currents, and pure audacity. You brought with you the essentials, a few taro roots, chickens that wouldn't stop screaming, and faith in the gods who supposedly guided your canoe. What you didn't bring was an exit strategy. The island, when you arrive, is lush, a dream carved in green and basalt. Giant palms sway like they're gossiping about you. The air smells of wet soil and bird colonies. Thousands of seabirds nest in the trees, completely unafraid, because nothing here has ever wanted to eat them. Yet you, however, are starving, and they look suspiciously like dinner. Within hours of landing, your people are roasting the first of many things that will never come back. But don't get too comfortable. This paradise is deceptive. From a distance it looks like an endless forest, but it's only 24 kilometers long, smaller than most cities' ring roads. There are no streams, no large animals, no metals, and the soil, though fertile for now, is as thin as patience in a long meeting. You've essentially settled on a large, scenic rock with commitment issues. Still, it's home now. You name the cliffs, the coves, the hills. You divide the land by clan, build stone houses that can withstand the wind, and start planting sweet potatoes because, well, the sea's too big and you're not going back. At night, under a sky so clear it could hum, you think about the world you left behind, the distant islands that now only exist in your stories. You tell your children about the ancestors who sailed by stars, who spoke to the spirits in the waves, who never feared the ocean's edge. You tell them this island is sacred, that it was chosen. It makes you feel better about the fact that it's also the end of the line. But beginnings have a strange way of disguising their endings. Because while you're carving out a new world on this lonely rock, the seeds of its collapse are already taking root beneath your feet. You won't notice it yet, not while the palms are still swaying and the soil still yields. For now, there's only promise, forests to clear, statues to dream up, gods to please. The silence of the island feels holy. Later, it'll feel like judgment, so you've decided to stay. Bold choice. You and your small community have claimed this floating rock like it's the navel of the world, and in a way, it is. There's nothing beyond it, not for thousands of kilometers. You've traded ocean storms for volcanic soil, open water for open sky. The rest of humanity will forget you exist for the next 500 years, which is either tragic or peaceful, depending on your tolerance for small talk. Here, everything depends on what you can grow, carve, or believe in. You plant taro, yams, bananas, and sweet potatoes, those quiet roots that never argue but demand constant attention. Chickens become your livestock of choice, small, portable, and stubbornly loud. Fish are a luxury now. Without tall trees, you'll eventually struggle to build big canoes. But for the moment, You're still connected to your Polynesian ancestry, that vast maritime civilization that moved across the Pacific like it owned it. In this isolation, something beautiful and mildly terrifying happens. Culture becomes concentrated. Without trade or war to dilute it, your rituals, myths, and hierarchies grow dense. Every stone, every word, every gesture becomes loaded with meaning. You divide yourselves into clans, martyr, each tracing descent from a common ancestor who, naturally, was part divine. The gods you brought across the sea evolved to fit this new landscape. Volcanoes, winds, and waves aren't just natural forces anymore. They're temperamental relatives with strong opinions about how you plant your crops. Leadership forms around those who can speak to both the living and the dead, chiefs, priests, navigators turned philosophers. Your worth isn't just measured in food or land, but in mana, the invisible spiritual force that makes people obey you without quite knowing why. It's power with paperwork you can't read. Each clan begins building ceremonial platforms ahu at the edges of the island, as if trying to signal the ancestors or anyone out there who might still be watching. Spoiler, no one is. Still, you thrive. The air fills with smoke from cooking fires and chants from rituals that blend politics, weather forecasting, and social drama into one. You tattoo your skin with stories of lineage and bravery. You carve wooden figures, build stone walls, and arrange the bones of your dead with meticulous reverence. The landscape becomes a mirror of belief, every hill a myth, every rock a witness. But isolation does strange things to ambition. When there's no one left to impress but yourselves, you start competing with ghosts. Each clan tries to outdo the others in displays of devotion. Who can feed more people? Who can build the grandest platform? Who can honor the ancestors most extravagantly? The answer, as always, is the one who builds bigger statues. You don't know it yet, but your quiet island just signed up for an arms race of stone faces and divine pride. Soon, carving gods will become the national pastime, and every palm tree you chop down will take you one heartbeat closer to silence. Let's talk about your statues. Because somewhere between feeding your chickens and chanting at sunrise, you decided your dead relatives should be enormous and made of stone. Not just any stone, volcanic tough, soft enough to carve but heavy enough to destroy your spine. You call them moai. To you, they're not art, they're extensions of the ancestors' big, watchful, silent presences meant to radiate protection and prestige. To everyone else in history, they're just bafflingly huge heads that make people in documentaries whisper reverently for no reason. If you'd lived here, your daily life would have revolved around the quarry at Rano Raraku, a vast crater that became both workshop and shrine. Hundreds of figures stand there mid-birth, half carved into the rock like giants who fell asleep before they could stand. You, along with dozens of clan members, would spend months chiseling one face after another with stone tools. No metal in sight. No wheels, and no complaints, because this was sacred labor. You weren't just carving rock, you were calling the dead into form. Each statue had its own clan identity, the tilt of the nose, the line of the jaw, the subtle smirk that says, "Our lineage is slightly better than yours." When finished, the moai could weigh anywhere from 5 to 80 tons. Moving them was its own ceremony. You tied ropes around them, rocked them side to side, and walked them to their ahu like obedient, massive toddlers. It worked, sort of. Archaeologists still argue about the exact technique, but one thing's clear. You didn't need aliens. You just needed rope, rhythm, and way too much free time. Once erected, the moai were fitted with red scoria topknots, pukao, carved from another quarry altogether. These symbolized hair or hats, depending on who you ask. Their eyes, made of coral and stone, were placed only during ceremonies, animating them with mana, that sacred power you could neither see nor question. When those eyes opened, your ancestors were literally watching you, which, depending on your behavior, was either comforting or horrifying. But here's the catch. Each moai was also a political billboard. The bigger the statue, the stronger the chief, the holier the clan. Soon, this island of barely a few thousand people was covered in hundreds of towering stone faces, each silently shouting, "We're more blessed than you." What started as reverence turned into competition. One-upmanship disguised as spirituality, or maybe spirituality disguised as one-upmanship. Every new statue required more labor, more food, more wood to move it. And slowly, the island began to groan under the weight of devotion. You didn't notice the hills getting barer, the birds vanishing, or the canoes becoming smaller. You were too busy perfecting the next ancestor's jawline. By now, the moai faced the land, not the sea, protecting the living, or perhaps warning them. Their stony silence would outlast everything else you built. You thought you were making eternity. In truth, you were carving the preface to collapse. So, here's the part that still drives modern engineers to drink. You moved those stone giants without a single wheel, pulley, or draft animal. Not even a decent tree left for a log roller. Just you, your clan, and a lot of rope made from bark that frayed faster than your patience. If you'd lived on Rapa Nui, this would have been your version of cardio hauling. 50-ton statues across uneven lava rock, while pretending it was an act of devotion and not a logistical nightmare. At the quarry, you'd spend months carving each moai directly out of the cliff face, shaping the body, the elongated nose, the aloof expression that said, "I have better things to do than collapse under my own weight." Once finished, you'd cut grooves under its back, wedge it free, and somehow get the thing upright. That was the easy part. Then came the journey, several kilometers of uneven terrain, steep slopes, and the constant risk of dropping your ancestor's face into the dirt. A tragedy both spiritual and aesthetic. Now, no one knows exactly how you did it. Some scholars think you rolled them on wooden sledges over log rails. Others believe you rocked them side to side, walking them forward using ropes. The walking theory, tested by some very optimistic archaeologists, actually works if you have 50 people, perfect coordination, and no concern for your lower back. Either way, it was slow, brutal, and spectacular. Each step forward was a small miracle, or at least a strong argument for why religion and back pain often go hand in hand. The irony: you weren't doing this for the gods. You were doing it for the neighbors. Every moai that reached its ahu meant prestige, power, and bragging rights for your clan. The bigger it was, the louder it spoke, without saying a single word. So you built roads that weren't for trade or travel, but for statues. Whole causeways designed to move stone faces inch by inch, leaving behind a trail of crushed vegetation and exhausted laborers. You could have used your resources to build fishing boats, maybe explore again, reconnect with your Polynesian cousins before your trees vanished. But no, you built a sculpture park of divine surveillance instead. Each new statue consumed more wood for hauling, more ropes for pulling, more food for the workers. You were literally burning the future to honor the past, an artistic choice if there ever was one. Still, let's not pretend it wasn't impressive. You transformed an island into a gallery of ancestors that could stare down time itself. The moai weren't just monuments. They were proof that your society could bend stone in ritual to its will. But the same ingenuity that raised them would soon erase the forests that made them possible. And without trees, well, your civilization was about to learn how loud silence can be. If you had been born on Rapa Nui in its glory days, you'd wake up every morning to the sound of adzes striking wood, the heartbeat of the island. The palms were your lifeline. They gave you canoes, houses, fire, tools, rope, and even shade from a sun that had no mercy. They were also the bones of your religion. Without trees, no statues could walk, no ancestors could rise. So naturally, you cut them all down. It started small, clearing a few groves to plant sweet potatoes, carve boats, or haul a particularly stubborn moai. There were thousands of jubia palms back then, as tall as redwoods, with trunks thick enough to hide a man behind. The birds nested in them, the wind sang through them, and no one thought they'd ever vanish. But like every civilization with a bit too much confidence, you assumed abundance was eternal. As the population grew, so did the appetite. You needed more ropes, more canoes, more fuel for cooking, and more logs to move those 80-ton stone celebrities. Then came the rats, stowaways from your first canoes, furry saboteurs with a taste for palm nuts. They gnawed the seeds before they could sprout, turning regeneration into a slow-motion tragedy. Within a few generations, the mighty palms stopped coming back. By around 1600, the forest was gone. Imagine standing on a hill that once swayed with green, and now seeing nothing but grass and stumps. The soil, stripped of its roots, began sliding away in the rain. Crops grew thinner. Birds disappeared, taking with them your main source of protein and feathers for ceremonies. Canoe building became an archaeological fantasy. There simply weren't any trees big enough left. Fishing turned coastal, small, and desperate. You tried to adapt, of course. You built stone gardens manavai, little rock enclosures that trapped moisture and protected fragile plants from the wind. Ingenious, really, but the loss ran deeper than hunger. The palms had been your connection to the gods, the sacred medium that turned devotion into action. Without them, you could no longer move your moe. The ancestors stopped walking, the gods stopped listening. And in a twist of cosmic irony, the same trees you'd felled for spiritual glory became the reason your faith began to crumble. You couldn't feed the workers, couldn't haul new statues, couldn't even leave the island if you'd wanted to. The sea mocked you, endless, blue, unreachable. You were trapped inside your own monument, but humans are stubborn creatures. You didn't stop believing, you just shifted your devotion. When the forest died, the world you'd built around it began to reshape itself. Still spiritual, still proud, but darker, hungrier, and much less forgiving. The moe stood silent, the soil turned thin, and somewhere in that stillness, a new faith began to stir among the ruins of the old. So now you're standing on a treeless island, surrounded by endless water, holding a broken digging stick, wondering where it all went wrong. The palms are gone, the birds are gone, and the only thing left thriving are rats and regret. Without trees, the soil begins to bleed into the sea, fields turn patchy, sweet potatoes grow small and bitter. Like you start to realize something uncomfortable. The gods you worked so hard to please might not be very good at crisis management. Deforestation wasn't just an environmental disaster, it was social collapse with a soundtrack of chanting. You couldn't build big canoes anymore, so long-distance fishing died. No more expeditions, no more trading with the sea. The island turned inward, a closed system with no new inputs and too many mouths. The same population that had once built monuments now had to tear up the past just to survive. You can't eat ancestry, and yet you kept trying to keep the ritual machinery going. The chiefs, desperate to maintain their manor, ordered more ceremonies, more offerings, more prayers, as if reciting longer hymns might coax trees back from extinction. Priests blamed the people for losing faith. People blamed the chiefs for angering the ancestors. And deep down, everyone suspected that maybe, just maybe, it wasn't divine will, it was bad management. The moe started falling, quite literally. Without the resources to maintain them, many toppled over, whether from neglect, earthquakes, or deliberate defiance. Oral histories tell of the Hurimoye, the period of struggling, when rival clans began pushing down the stone faces of their enemies' ancestors. Imagine it, centuries of divine authority, shoved face first into the dirt. The sound of rebellion wasn't shouting, it was granite hitting ground. Conflict followed hunger. As food supplies dwindled, so did patience. Clans fought over garden plots, waterholes, and whatever chickens hadn't yet been eaten. Fortified caves and defensive walls appeared where temples once stood. Spears replaced chisels. You even started making smaller statues, crude wooden figures with angry eyes. The moe Kavakava, half ancestor, half hunger demon. That's what happens when devotion meets famine. Art starts losing weight. Still, the collapse wasn't instant. It was a slow unraveling, like a rope fraying in silence. You adapted where you could, using volcanic rock mulch to trap moisture, building windbreaks, recycling sacred stones for survival. But every solution came too late to replace what had been lost. The island had turned from a canvas of belief into a mirror of consequence. And somewhere, amid the hunger and the dust, a new idea began to take hold. One that didn't rely on forests or stone giants. One that promised renewal through endurance and cunning. The moe no longer walked, but faith, being the most persistent parasite known to humanity, simply changed form. By now, you've stopped pretending everything's fine. The moe are falling, the chiefs are losing their shine, and the old prayers echo without answers. You're no longer a builder of gods, you're a scavenger of their ruins. The island that once rang with the sound of chisels now hums with tension. Every clan for itself. Every meal a negotiation. You start reusing what you once worshipped. Stones from toppled Ahu platforms become garden walls. Sacred spaces turn into shelters. The same hands that once carved the ancestors are now digging for tubers, fighting for chickens, or sharpening spears. In oral traditions, they call it the time of the long ears and short ears. Though those weren't mythical creatures, they were just factions. The long ears were the old elite, descendants of statue builders. The short ears were the laborers who'd had enough of hauling other people's ancestors uphill. Spoiler, The short ears eventually won. Warfare became ritualized at first, small raids, skirmishes, ambushes near gardens. But as food vanished, things turned savage. You built fortified caves and dugouts, hiding during raids. Some traditions even hint at cannibalism, not as a culture, but as a breakdown. People didn't eat each other for sport. They did it because they were starving, and because, well, symbolism has always been humanity's favorite seasoning. Still, even in ruin, you found rhythm. Rapa Nui people didn't just collapse and vanish like the doom narratives love to claim. You adapted, you learned to live on less. You planted gardens in stone circles, protecting fragile crops from wind and evaporation. You bred more chickens, buried eggs for storage, and collected rainwater in pits lined with banana leaves. It wasn't abundance, but it was survival, stubborn, ingenious survival. And then there were the statues, lying face down like fallen gods. Their blank eyes stared at the soil they'd once blessed. For the first time in centuries, the island had no divine hierarchy. And strangely, that vacuum sparked a new energy, a kind of cultural reboot. You stopped trying to resurrect the past and started searching for something different, a belief system that didn't depend on trees, stone, or obedience to the dead. The landscape became quieter, fewer rituals, fewer feasts, fewer grand displays of power. But out of that silence, a new voice began to emerge. The islanders turned their gaze away from the motionless Maui and toward something still alive, still moving. The sky, the sea, and the birds, especially the birds. They came once a year, in clouds that darkened the horizon, nesting on cliffs and offshore islets. In their arrival, you saw renewal, promise, maybe even redemption. If the ancestors had failed you, perhaps the gods had simply changed their feathers. So, after centuries of stone obsession, your ancestors finally looked up. Literally, the sky filled with sooty, turned sleek black and white birds that returned each spring to nest on the cliffs and offshore islets. They became the new messengers between worlds, the ones who still bothered to come back. And from their wings, your people built an entirely new religion. The Moai were silent, the birds were alive, and for an island stripped bare, that was enough. Welcome to the age of the Tangata Manu, the Birdman. Think of it as a spiritual reboot. Less divine monarchy, more ritualized survival Olympics. Every year, when the turns returned, the clans gathered at Orongo, a ceremonial village perched on the rim of the Ranokau crater. The view was breathtaking, vast sea, steep cliffs, and a few treacherous islets speckled in the distance. From there, the chiefs and their champions competed to retrieve the first turn egg of the season from the islet of Motunui. Picture it. Dozens of men scaling the cliffs barefoot, diving into shark-infested waters, swimming through pounding surf, and scrambling over rocks slick with guano, all for an egg. Not even a golden one, just a regular bird egg. Whoever's servant returned first with it intact earned his chief the title of Birdman for the year, a living conduit between humans and the gods. Glory, manna, and bragging rights restored. It wasn't just sport, it was survival theater. In a society without trees, the egg symbolized renewal, fertility, continuity, all the things the soil no longer promised. The Birdman himself would be shaved, tattooed, and ritually secluded for months, treated as both sacred and untouchable. For 1 year, his word carried divine weight. Then the cycle would begin again, fragile as a shell. The old Moai cult wasn't gone, just demoted. He still prayed to the ancestors, but now they shared the stage with flying deities and living competitors. The island's art shifted to rock carvings of birdmen, faces merged with beaks, feathers etched into stone. The god Make, the creator, became the new focus of devotion, half divine trickster, half fertility spirit, a deity born not from stone, but from adaptation. And perhaps that's the most human thing about it. When the world falls apart, we don't stop believing, we just change the costumes. The Birdman cult was Rapa Nui's way of reasserting order in chaos, a ritual that replaced despair with endurance. It took what was left, cliffs, birds, ocean, and built meaning from scarcity. Still, even that fragile balance wouldn't last forever, because while your ancestors were learning to worship renewal, the outside world was sailing closer, curious, armed, and carrying diseases that didn't care for gods, stone, or feathers. The next time strangers appeared on the horizon, they wouldn't be birds, By now, you've learned to live with the silence of an island that once sang with forests. The palms are only memories, ghosts, shadows in the wind, and the birds, though sacred, only visit. You've become a specialist in making do. If scarcity were an art form, you'd have a museum by now. Your world is built from stone, not just for statues, but for survival. You construct Manavai's circular rock gardens that trap heat and moisture, tiny miracles of microclimate in a landscape that's all glare and wind. You mulch the soil with broken basalt to hold in dew, because water is something you now persuade, not find. Farming becomes a quiet form of prayer. Every sweet potato that sprouts feels like forgiveness. The houses you build are strange and beautiful. Low stone vaults, shaped like overturned boats, aerodynamic against the gusts, dark and cool inside. There's no wood left for beams, so you build with what you have. Volcanic rock and patience. You sleep close to the earth, because there's nowhere else to go. You've turned to chickens, now your main source of protein and status. They're guarded like treasure. You even build little stone forts, hair mower, to keep them safe from rats and neighbors. Eggs are currency. Feathers are sacred. You no longer need temples or palaces. Every garden, every chicken pen is an altar to survival. And yet, you don't despair. You still dance. You still carve. The moai lie scattered across the island like the fallen gods of a previous age. But you don't hate them. You live among them. Some stand half-buried, their faces eroding gently into the soil. They've become part of the landscape, ghosts of ambition now, keeping the wind company. Trade with the sea shrinks to the reefs. With no large trees, you paddle small rafts, stitched from reeds, fishing close to shore. Tuna and deep-sea fish are memories. You catch what you can, parrotfish, eels, urchins. You dry them in the sun and tell stories under the stars about ancestors who once crossed oceans, a kind of cosmic nostalgia you cling to between meals. And yet, even in that isolation, there's rhythm. The Birdman ritual continues, marking the seasons, birth, hunger, renewal. Repeat. You have no forests, no gods of abundance, but you still have culture, adaptive, stubborn, alive. Rapa Nui doesn't disappear into myth. It adjusts. Still, the ocean horizon holds a strange tension now. The birds come from there, yes, but one day, something else will, too. A new kind of vessel. One you've never imagined, carrying faces that look nothing like your own, speaking in sounds that will cut the silence open like a blade. It happens suddenly, like a myth arriving late to its own story. One morning, you see sails on the horizon. Not clouds, not birds, not omens, sails. White, enormous, impossible. You've never seen fabric move like that, swallowing the wind hole. The elders squint from the cliffs, blinking against the sun, and someone mutters the only logical conclusion. The gods have finally decided to return. Except they haven't. It's 1722, Easter Sunday. And what's approaching is a Dutch warship under Jacob Roggeveen, the first European to stumble upon Rapa Nui, and immediately rename it after his own calendar. You, of course, already have a perfectly good name for it, Rapa Nui, the Great Rapa. But explorers are like toddlers with maps. They label everything they find as if it had been waiting for them. From the deck, Roggeveen's men see hundreds of statues staring inland, massive and solemn, and assume they're gods. They also note the islanders. You are almost naked, tanned, and friendly, which for 18th century sailors is code for probably harmless. It's an optimistic misreading that lasts about 20 minutes, because curiosity and muskets make a bad combination. When you approach the ships, offering gifts and gestures of welcome, a misunderstanding sparks, a noise, a movement, perhaps a perceived threat, and gunfire follows. A handful of your people are shot dead on the shore before the Dutch even finish marveling at the statues. The first contact between Rapa Nui and Europe is not a handshake, it's a volley. Still, they write glowing reports. They call you noble, agile, ingenious, all the adjectives explorers use right before they ruin someone's century. They count the moai, sketch the coast, and note the absence of trees with academic surprise, as if they hadn't just burned half a forest themselves to cook dinner on previous voyages. They stay barely a week, long enough to baptize the island with their own mythology and leave you a few iron nails, little talismans of a world you'll never see. When they sail away, the island returns to its silence. The sea closes like a curtain, but something has shifted. You've seen steel, you've seen ships, You've seen men who cross oceans in floating fortresses. The gods, it turns out, are human and armed. The elders call it an omen, the priests argue over its meaning, and the people whisper about the strangers who came from beyond the horizon. You don't know it yet, but the world has found you, and it doesn't plan to let go. The next ships that arrive won't just come to look, they'll come to take. Once the Dutch left, you probably thought the whole god arrival thing had been a one-time celestial glitch. But the horizon doesn't forget. 50 years later, it happens again. Different sails, different flags, same story. The Spanish arrive in 1770, plant a cross, claim your island for a king you've never heard of, and leave before lunch. Then the British show up. Captain Cook in 1774, with better manners, worse germs, and a notebook full of curiosity. They all come for the same reason. The myth of a lost paradise with giant statues and no trees. They take notes, measurements, and a few of your words, then sail off with your name replaced by theirs. The French drop by in the 1780s, trading trinkets for food, introducing syphilis, because nothing says cross-cultural exchange, quite like an incurable souvenir, and writing home about the mystery of your vanished forests, as if they hadn't just chopped down half of Tahiti. At first, it's just annoying strangers popping in uninvited, renaming things, sketching your ancestors like they're curiosities in a natural history cabinet. But by the 19th century, it turns brutal. In 1862, Peruvian slave raiders arrive, ships full of men with guns and chains. They promise trade, then capture nearly 2,000 islanders, half your remaining population, and sail them away to work in mines and plantations. Priests, chiefs, healers, all taken. Most never return. When a few captives are finally released, they bring smallpox with them. It spreads faster than fire on dry grass. Within a few years, the island's population collapses to barely 100 souls. Imagine that. Your entire world, every story, every ritual, every memory reduced to a handful of survivors. It's not mythic tragedy, it's paperwork. Diseases don't need poetry to win. The visitors keep coming. Of course, whalers, missionaries, traders, each convinced they're helping. They rename your gods, redraw your maps, and tell you salvation now comes with Latin hymns. The old cults fade under the weight of imported piety. The Birdman disappears. The Moai are toppled again, this time not by rival clans, but by foreign zeal. And through it all, you keep going. You learn to hide songs inside prayers, stories inside silence. You bury language beneath the polite yeses that the missionaries prefer. You've seen what happens to those who resist too loudly. They get shipped off, or die unnamed. So you adapt. Again. That's the thing about islands. Isolation breeds ingenuity, but it also breeds endurance. By the time the century turns, the visitors will stop pretending it's exploration. They'll start calling it ownership. And your island, once a self-contained world, will become a footnote in someone else's empire. If the slavers had taken bodies, the missionaries came for everything else. They arrived in the 1860s with Bibles, casacks, and that unnerving missionary confidence that makes people mistake destruction for salvation. You've survived famine, war, and disease, but nothing prepares you for moral paperwork. They set up altars where Moai once stood, replaced songs with hymns, and assured you that the ancestors you'd worshipped for centuries were, in fact, theologically incorrect. To their credit, they meant well. Most colonizers do at first. They saw an island of survivors, traumatized and starving, and decided that what you really needed was Latin. They baptized the last chiefs, dismantled shrines, and declared victory over idolatry. You watched as the Moai were pushed over again, not by rival clans this time, but by men in robes wielding crucifixes like chisels. The irony was thick enough to need carving tools. They brought literacy, yes, but only in scripture. They brought structure, but only to dismantle the old one. The Birdman cult was outlawed, its rituals labeled savage. Even the word manna was replaced by grace, though both meant the same thing: invisible power you're not supposed to question. Soon, your children were speaking the missionaries' language, praying to their God, and learning to call your own history pagan. The island's population, already shattered by raids and epidemics, dwindled further under the weight of this new order. The survivors were herded into Hangaroa, a single village the missionaries could supervise. The rest of the island, your ancestral land, your quarries, your ceremonial sites, was declared sacred property of the church. fenced off for the righteous. You weren't allowed to wander the hills where your grandparents had carved gods out of stone. Imagine being forbidden to visit your own ghosts. Yet, even in submission, resistance found cracks. The old chants survived in lullabies. The names of gods slipped quietly into the Christian saints. You'd pray to the Virgin Mary, but somewhere between the words, you'd still whisper to Micmac. The missionaries heard piety. You meant memory. Every baptism became a double act, one for the record books, one for the ancestors. By the late 19th century, the island was unrecognizable. The moai lay scattered, the temples eroded, the faiths merged into a quiet syncretic defiance. You'd become a living archive, an entire culture condensed into human memory, because everything written had been rewritten. But history wasn't done with you yet. Beyond the church fences, another flag was already being stitched, one that would claim the island not for heaven, but for profit. The next occupiers wouldn't come with crosses, they'd come with contracts. When the missionaries finally loosened their grip, you'd think maybe, just maybe, the island might breathe again. But no, the next saviors arrive wearing suits instead of carsacks. It's 1888, and Chile shows up with a treaty, a handshake, and that classic colonial promise, we'll take care of everything. They annex Rapa Nui. Politely, of course, though no one bothers to explain what annex actually means. In practical terms, it means your island now belongs to someone who's never seen it. A few years later, a Scottish sheep company leases the whole place. Yes, the entire island, temples, cliffs, quarries, and graves, all converted into pasture. The new owners fence it off with barbed wire and livestock. Congratulations, the land of your ancestors is now a business plan. You and what's left of your community, barely a few hundred souls, are confined to one small corner. The village of Hangaroa. You can't cross the fences without permission. You can't fish where your grandparents fished. You can't visit the moai, not even to mourn. Your island has become a farm, and you are the labor. The company installs a manager, naturally. He oversees the sheep, the fences, and the inconvenient humans. You're paid in rations, or not at all. Children herd animals among the toppled statues. The great Ahu platforms crumble under hooves. Where once priests sang hymns to gods, you now hear bleating and the sound of shears. The island that once worshipped stone now measures wool. And yet, even in this humiliation, you persist. You sing in secret, sometimes in whispers over the sound of wind. You carve small wooden figures, moai kavakava, thin, haunted, almost skeletal, like memory itself refusing to die. The missionaries may have taken your temples, the ranches your land, but you still have your hands. Every carving becomes a rebellion disguised as craft. Occasionally, a foreign ship drops anchor. Scientists, tourists, naval officers, they stare at the moai, scribble notes, and marvel at how such a primitive people could have built something so grand. They never stay long enough to see the fences, or the locked gates, or the people living in the shadow of their own monuments. History, as always, edits for comfort. By the early 20th century, the world begins to rediscover Rapa Nui through their eyes, not yours. Explorers and ethnographies turn your suffering into footnotes. They call it mystery. They love that word. It keeps the story romantic, tidy, and unsolved, as if you vanished in a puff of myth instead of colonial paperwork. But fences, like faith, don't last forever. The sheep company's lease will eventually expire. The island will reopen. Archaeologists will come with shovels, cameras, and questions you've been answering for centuries. They'll call it rediscovery. You'll call it Tuesday. By the early 1900s, the fences begin to rust, the empire's grip weakens, and suddenly the outside world rediscovers you. Like a long-lost relic, it forgot to label properly. Western archaeologists arrive with notebooks, cameras, and that wide-eyed expression scholars wear when they think they're the first to notice something that's been standing there for 1,000 years. Remarkable, they say, pointing at the moai. You'd agree if your people hadn't carved them generations before their grandmothers were born. The first major expedition comes with Catherine Routledge in 1914, a British anthropologist who, to her credit, actually listens. She records your stories, sketches your sites, and realizes that those mysterious heads the world obsesses over are, in fact, full bodies buried in their own soil. The statues aren't sinking. Time is simply piling up around them. The metaphor writes itself. Then, decades later, Thor Heyerdahl sails in on his Bolsward ego, convinced that you couldn't possibly have built the Moai without foreign inspiration. He proposes South Americans did it, because nothing says academic humility like denying Polynesians their own genius. He stages dramatic experiments, proving what you already knew, that the statues can walk. You watch politely as he reenacts your ancestors' work, declares victory, and sails away. Excavations multiply. Teams uncover roads, quarries, and ceremonial platforms. Each revelation celebrated as a breakthrough, though you've been living next to the evidence for centuries. Still, you humor them. After all, at least now the world is interested in preserving what it once ignored. Restoration begins in the 1960s. Toppled Moai are raised again, platforms rebuilt, fragments reassembled. It's archaeology as resurrection, minus the theology. Tourists follow the archaeologists, of course. Planes replace canoes. The island, once unreachable, becomes a stop on the world's bucket list. People pose smiling beside statues of your ancestors, completely unaware that they're standing in someone's graveyard. Guides explain the rituals with scripted enthusiasm while stray dogs nap under the ahu. The air smells faintly of sunscreen and irony. And yet, amid the spectacle, something beautiful happens. The act of excavation becomes an act of recovery, not just for science, but for identity. Your language, long suppressed, resurfaces in schools. Songs return to ceremonies. The descendants of those who built the Moai now stand beside them again, not as curiosities, but as caretakers. The narrative starts shifting from mystery to memory, but the world still wants its myth. They keep asking the same question: what happened here? As if the answer were buried under a single stone. You smile, because you know the truth isn't tragic or magical, it's human. The island didn't vanish, it adapted, it endured. Still, for every story reclaimed, a new one emerges about survival, reclamation, and the uneasy silence left when centuries of voices finally fade into the wind. And that silence, it turns out, speaks volumes. So here we are, standing at the edge of it all, the last chapter of an island that once believed stone could speak. The Moai are still here, weathered and solemn, their faces eroded into the expressions of beings who've seen too much. The forests are gone, the clans dissolved, the gods renamed, and yet, somehow, the island still breathes. You can hear it in the wind that moves over the grass where palms once stood, in the sea that keeps licking the cliffs like it's trying to erase history, but can't quite manage it. If you'd been born here now, you'd grow up hearing two versions of the same story. One, the tourist version about mystery, collapse, and lessons for humanity. The other, the real one, about resilience, adaptation, and the slow, stubborn act of remembering. Because despite everything, famine, raids, slavery, religion, and ranches, the people of Rapa Nui are still here. They dance, they carve, they speak the language the world thought it had erased. The island today is no ghost. It's alive, just quieter, more deliberate. Tourists walk the trails with cameras, archaeologists measure angles of jaws, and descendants tend the sacred platforms as their ancestors did. Though now, with grant funding and sunscreen, you might think the story ends in tragedy, but it doesn't. It ends in endurance, the kind that hides beneath humility, the kind that doesn't need statues anymore to prove it exists. And maybe that's the real trick of Rapa Nui. The world loves to call it a warning, the cautionary tale of overexploitation, the civilization that destroyed itself. It makes people feel better to imagine that collapse is neat and moral. But collapse isn't moral, it's messy. What happened here wasn't a single mistake. It was 1,000 small, understandable choices. Plant a field, move a stone, build one more monument. None of them wrong in isolation, just too human in combination. Still, you can't help admiring them, can you? Those people who carved mountains into memory, who turned isolation into art, who survived even when their gods stopped answering. There's something almost heroic about their stubbornness, that refusal to vanish neatly for the sake of narrative symmetry. The island didn't fall silent because it was doomed. It went quiet because it was listening to itself, to the ocean, to the slow work of time erasing arrogance and leaving awe. And when you stand there now, under a sky so wide it feels prehistoric, surrounded by the faces of your own ancestors turned to stone, you realize something simple. The silence of Rapa Nui isn't emptiness, it's continuity. It's what survival sounds like after the noise of civilization fades. The Moai still stare inland, toward the people who built them, not out to sea, but home, always home. There's a corner of the Pacific where the world seems to have ended early, a triangular scrap of volcanic rock adrift in 3,000 kilometers of empty sea. The nearest inhabited land is so far away that even the birds look tired when they arrive. This is Rapa Nui, a place that shouldn't exist and yet somehow does. A geographical punchline that evolution and human stubbornness conspired to make permanent. When Polynesian navigators first landed here, sometime around the 13th century, they were already among the most extraordinary travelers on Earth. They'd been crossing ocean basins long before Europe realized there was more than one of them. They arrived not by accident but by faith, a kind of maritime clairvoyance guided by stars, wind, and a quiet conversation with waves. What they found must have felt like winning and losing at the same time. An island lush with palms and seabirds, but small enough to walk across before lunch. Paradise, yes, but with a visible edge. The soil was generous. For a while, the first generations planted sweet potatoes, taro, yams, crops that carried the warmth of older islands in their roots. They hunted the seabirds that nested without fear in the cliffs and forests, cooked them over palm fires, and built villages sheltered from the wind. It was a soft beginning, the kind that tricks people into believing nature likes them. But Rapa Nui was never a place for balance. It was too small for innocence, too far for help, too beautiful to resist. Isolation did strange things here. Cut off from trade, conquest, or outside opinion, culture fermented like something sealed in a jar, thick, potent, and slightly unstable. Over time, the people of Rapa Nui built not just homes and gardens, but an entire cosmology out of lava rock and imagination. Every ridge, crater, and wave became part of a sacred conversation between the living and the dead. The island wasn't simply lived on, it was listened to. Volcanoes that had been sleeping for hundreds of thousands of years became the stage for a new kind of creation. Basalt, tuff, red scoria, all took on divine significance. Stone was memory, permanence, proof that human hands could outlast wind. Maybe that's why this little island, smaller than most modern cities, decided to dream in stone. It began to turn its ancestors into mountains. From that dream, the Moai were born, towering faces cut from the bones of volcanoes, each one a monument to both devotion and vanity. They would watch over the living, protect the clans, and conveniently remind everyone who was in charge. Faith and politics often share a pillow, and yet, before the first chisel struck the first cliff, before the first ancestor's face took shape in volcanic dust, the island had already whispered its warning. Every tree felled, every bird hunted, every ritual fire lit carried a cost that only time would calculate. But the people of Rapa Nui didn't hear it, or perhaps they did and simply refused to listen. The sea was too wide, the sky too quiet, and ambition too loud. The first statue was still sleeping in the rock when the idea took hold that memory could be engineered, that stone could keep watch when humans failed too. It was a comforting illusion. Soon, carving the divine would become a national obsession, a labor of faith and competition. The island's heartbeat would shift from the rhythm of waves to the tap of chisels, and from that quarry of quiet gods, the ancestors would begin to rise. The statues were never just statues. Each one was an ancestor, a memory with a jawline. The Rapa Nui didn't see them as art or architecture, but as vessels, bodies for spirits, too vast and too sacred to leave an anchor. They called them Moai, which doesn't mean idol or god, but something closer to presence, the kind of presence that changes a landscape simply by existing. They faced inland, always inland, never watching the ocean that had brought their descendants here. Their gaze was fixed on the villages, the fields, the people. To stand before a Moai was to feel supervision in its purest form, not divine wrath, just ancestral disappointment. Their eyes, when finally placed, were made of white coral with obsidian pupils, set into sockets like lighthouses of the soul. That was the moment they awoke, when the mana, the spiritual power of the ancestor, entered stone. Before that, they were simply bodies awaiting possession. Every clan had its lineage, its sacred bloodline, and its preferred ancestor to a Moai. The chief, or someone ambitious enough to act like one, would commission a Moai to declare both devotion and dominance. Each figure bore a specific resemblance, though stylized beyond realism. The long nose, the high cheekbones, the lips sealed in a permanent negotiation between pride and silence. There was no need for names. Everyone knew who they were. The Moai stood on Ahu, great stone platforms built at the edge of the island, where land met the vast nothingness of sea. It wasn't a coincidence. The Ahu were both tombs and altars, containing the bones of those they represented. The dead weren't just remembered, they were literally beneath the feet of their stone likenesses. In that way, death and guardianship shared the same address. The scale was absurd, of course. Each statue could weigh as much as 10 elephants, and some reached over 10 meters tall, but size wasn't excess. It was theology. A larger ancestor meant more mana, more protection, more prestige, more cosmic authority. And since no clan wanted to appear underpowered, the competition to build ever taller Moai became inevitable. Spiritual devotion quickly learned the language of ego. Still, beneath the rivalry, there was genuine reverence. To raise a Moai was to bridge the gap between mortality and eternity, a feat of engineering that doubled as metaphysics. The Rapa Nui believed that as long as the Moai stood, the land would remain fertile, the seasons predictable, and the social order intact. The ancestors didn't just bless the island, they kept it running. They were the silent administrators of fate, and perhaps that's the most haunting part. The people of Rapa Nui didn't carve gods to be worshipped, they carved family members to be obeyed. These weren't deities from some distant pantheon. They were the faces of grandparents, chiefs, and founders, people whose bones still lay underfoot. In a world this small, even eternity had relatives. But ancestors, like empires, are demanding. The Moai needed to be carved, moved, raised, and honored, each one bigger than the last. It wasn't enough to remember the dead. The living had to prove they were worthy of them. And so, the quarry became a temple, and labor became prayer. Soon, the island's hills would ring with the echo of hammerstones, the air thick with volcanic dust, and the question that would haunt archaeologists for centuries would finally take form. How do you make a mountain walk? At Ranoroku the gods were born sideways. The quarry, a volcanic crater scarred by centuries of ambition, was both workshop and womb. It was here that the Rapa Nui carved the impossible, hundreds of Moai still half embedded in the rock, as if the island had started dreaming and never quite woken up. The work began with basalt adzes toki, handheld stones no sharper than a kitchen knife and just as likely to shatter. Dozens of carvers, organized by rank and lineage, would chip away day after day, turning cliffs into foreheads, slopes into noses, and dust into theology. The stone was soft, yes, but relentless. Every chisel mark carried the weight of prayer and exhaustion. The Moai emerged flat against the mountainside, carved front first before being cut loose from the back, an act equal parts craftsmanship and childbirth. Each clan had its signature features. Some favored long, thin faces. Others carved broader jaws and smaller ears. To outsiders, they all look eerily similar. But to the Rapa Nui, every curve, every proportion was personal. You didn't just carve a statue, you resurrected an ancestor, and that required precision. Even a single mistake could fracture the tuff, forcing the carvers to abandon the half-formed spirit. Those unfinished figures still litter the slopes like divine casualties, caught mid-creation, eyes closed as if refusing to see what the island would become. The quarry wasn't just a workplace, it was sacred ground. Songs were sung to keep rhythm, offerings left to appease the spirits dwelling in the mountain. The carvers were craftsmen, yes, but also intermediaries between the living and the dead. They worked under the authority of priests who determined auspicious days for carving and warned against hubris. Of course, hubris was the whole point. The bigger your statue, the stronger your lineage, and nothing says ancestral respect like building a face taller than your house. When a Moai was nearly finished, the cliff was cut from beneath it, freeing the stone body from its cradle. The figure would then be slid, levered, or walked down the slope to its waiting platform. From the crater floor, you could see them lined up in various stages of completion, minus 887 in total. At last count, a petrified procession of ambition. The quarry looked like a frozen assembly line, each ancestor queued patiently for eternity. It's hard not to imagine the sound of it. The scrape of basalt against stone, the grunt of men hauling ropes, the low chanting that stitched together labor and faith. Archaeologists describe Rano Raraku as an industrial complex. That's technically true, but industry doesn't usually hum with devotion. These people weren't mass-producing art, they were mass-producing immortality. And yet, beneath all the ritual and reverence, something deeply human pulses through the dust, that peculiar urge to leave behind something enormous enough to outlast failure. The quarry gave the Rapa Nui not just their gods, but their identity. And once you start believing your worth is measured in stone, it's only a matter of time before you start moving mountains, literally. Because carving the divine was only half the miracle. The next challenge was getting it to stand upright, miles away, without breaking the ancestor or your back in the process. And somehow, they did it again and again, until the island was ringed with gods staring inland, proof that faith can move more than hearts. No one remembers the first person who looked at a 10-meter tall, 80-ton statue and said, "We can walk that," but someone did, and the island never stopped trying to prove them right. Moving the moai was more than logistics. It was choreography with consequences. Each clan developed its own version of the miracle, performed with ropes, songs, and whatever faith was left in their lower backs. The old explanations sound simple enough. Trees as rollers, sledges on logs, manpower by the hundreds. But this was Rapa Nui, where trees eventually became a rumor. Archaeologists found the evidence later: crushed roots, eroded slopes, fragments of palm pollen that whispered of forests long gone. Still, it worked for a while. They cut the logs, tied the ropes, and dragged their ancestors inch by inch across volcanic plains, leaving scars in the landscape like signatures of devotion. But then the forests ran out, the ropes broke, the statues got bigger, and desperation, as it often does, inspired genius. Some say they walked them upright, teetering from side to side, pulled by groups on each flank, their movement guided by rhythm and shouted chants. Modern experiments have tested the theory. With 3 ropes, 15 people, and a good sense of timing, a moai really can sway forward like an enormous, mildly disoriented pilgrim. It's absurd and magnificent at once. A god on parade, physics masquerading as ritual. To the people of Rapa Nui, this wasn't transportation, it was resurrection. Every successful journey was a ceremony, the ancestor's spirit traveling home to its platform. The moai weren't being moved, they were walking themselves, drawn by mana, that sacred energy linking the living and the dead. And when they finally reached their destination, the exhaustion of the workers wasn't just physical, it was spiritual. They had brought memory to life, and in doing so, renewed their own. Of course, not all of them made it. The roads between the quarry and the coast are lined with fallen moai, broken necks and cracked torsos littering the path like an army that fainted mid-march. Each one a monument to human error, or maybe to overconfidence, which is often the same thing. The Rapa Nui didn't clear them away. They left them where they fell, as if even failure deserved reverence. And then there were the Ahu, the sacred platforms waiting at the edge of the world. Once the moai reached their resting place, ropes and ramps lifted them upright, a slow, breathless process involving earth mounds and prayer. The final act was the placement of the coral eyes, the instant when stone became sentient. Watching it must have felt like watching the sun rise from a human face. The irony, of course, is that the very act that defined Rapa Nui's genius also guaranteed its undoing. Every rope required bark, every sledge needed wood, every worker needed food. Faith, it turns out, has an appetite. With each new monument, the island grew poorer and yet richer in belief. By the time the last moai stood, the island had nothing left to give but reverence. But no one stops building paradise just because the trees run out. They simply change what paradise looks like. And on Rapa Nui, that meant turning the earth into a cathedral of ancestors, a gallery of gods with impeccable posture and tragic timing. By the time the moai began to multiply, Rapa Nui wasn't so much an island as a stone resume. Every clan matter had its own lineage to glorify, its own ancestors to broadcast in high relief. The coastline became crowded with silent, judgmental faces staring inland, each one declaring, "Our dead love us more than yours do." It was religion, politics, and social media rolled into one. Centuries before anyone invented the humble brag, the logic was simple and exhausting. The bigger your moai, the greater your mana. Size wasn't vanity, it was legitimacy. Every statue was a public statement that your lineage could still command resources, feed laborers, and keep the cosmic order running. It didn't matter that food supplies were thinning or that palm trees were vanishing faster than patience during a committee meeting. What mattered was that your clan's ancestors looked sufficiently intimidating in profile. Competition has always been humanity's favorite apocalypse trigger. Rival clans pushed limits, building taller, heavier, and more elaborately carved moai. Each new monument had to outdo the last, a spiritual arms race conducted entirely in stone. The quarry at Rano Raraku turned into an ancient factory of prestige, with unfinished figures stacked like backlogged egos waiting for shipment. It wasn't blasphemy, it was branding. But prestige comes at a price, and on an island where every resource counts, ambition started eating its own tail. Forests fell to make ropes. Canoes shrank until deep-sea fishing became impossible. The more the moai grew, the smaller the world around them became. The island's soil, once lush and forgiving, began to thin under constant farming and erosion. Yet, to stop building was unthinkable, a public confession that your ancestors had lost faith in you. Still, the ceremonies went on. When a moai was finally raised on its ahu, the entire clan gathered for feasts and chants that could last for days. Drums echoed across the valleys. Torches lit the statues in orange glow. The priests invoked the ancestors, thanking them for their favor, though what they were really thanking was their own endurance. Faith and exhaustion often sound alike. Each moai, once awakened with its coral eyes, became a territorial sentinel, guardian, judge, and silent auditor of human conduct. They watched the people work the fields, settle disputes, and argue over resources that were quietly running out. The ancestors were meant to protect the land. Instead, they became witnesses to its decline. But there was no single moment of collapse, only a long, slow unraveling, disguised as ritual continuity. The Rapa Nui didn't know they were running out of trees. They only knew they were running out of prestige. And when survival and pride finally collided, something had to give. The moai, once symbols of unity and devotion, would soon turn into targets, massive, elegant casualties of resentment. Because when the food's gone and the gods stay silent, there's only one thing left to do with a monument: push it over. For all their size and solemnity, the moai weren't truly alive until the eyes were set. The Rapa Nui believed that a statue without eyes was only potential, a body waiting for its soul to arrive. So the moment came near the end of every ceremony. Coral discs, polished white, with obsidian or red scoria pupils, carefully placed into deep sockets. It was delicate work, done with ritual precision and a kind of reverent fear, because when those eyes opened, the ancestor came back. The activation wasn't symbolic, it was literal. The moai didn't just represent the dead, they became them. The spirit of the ancestor entered the statue and radiated mana, the invisible, potent force that governed everything from crop fertility to political legitimacy. The air around a newly awakened moai must have felt electric, as if the wind itself were suddenly paying attention. From that moment on, it wasn't just stone watching you. It was family, eternity, and cosmic accountability combined. The eyes faced inland for a reason. The ancestors weren't guarding against invaders from the sea. There were none. They were watching over the villages, the fields, the children playing near the hearth. Their gaze ensured that rituals were kept, boundaries respected, and hierarchies obeyed. It's one thing to disappoint your parents. It's another to disappoint a 6-meter ancestor made of volcanic tuff. Once awakened, the moai's eyes were rarely seen again. They were inserted only during ceremonies, and sometimes removed afterward, perhaps to rest the spirits, or to protect them from misuse. The fragments archaeologists later found scattered around the ahu shards of coral and obsidian were the remains of these moments, the residue of resurrection. It's hard not to think of it as theater, sacred high-stakes theater. The audience was the entire island, and the actors were the dead. The moai turned the coastline into a living gallery of surveillance and blessing, a panoramic lineup of authority that made sure everyone remembered their place. Even the wind, people said, shifted when the eyes looked out. And yet, there's something heartbreakingly human in that ritual, this need to make sure the past still cares. The Rapa Nui didn't build the moai out of arrogance. They built them out of fear of being forgotten. Each one was a prayer cast in basalt, an insistence that memory could be material. The eyes were insurance against oblivion. But eyes are double-edged things. They give life, but they also witness. And when the island's balance began to crumble, when crops failed, when hunger crept in, when clans turned on one another, those same watching eyes became unbearable. To live under the gaze of your ancestors while starving was its own kind of judgment. The Moai that once blessed the land began to feel like accusers. It wouldn't be long before some of those eyes were shattered, and others forced to stare at the ground. Faith, when cornered by survival, tends to look away. For all their size and solemnity, the Moai weren't truly alive until the eyes were set. The Rapa Nui believed that a statue without eyes was only potential, a body waiting for its soul to arrive. So the moment came near the end of every ceremony. Coral discs, polished white, with obsidian or red scoria pupils, carefully placed into deep sockets. It was delicate work, done with ritual precision and a kind of reverent fear. Because when those eyes opened, the ancestor came back. The activation wasn't symbolic, it was literal. The Moai didn't just represent the dead, they became them. The spirit of the ancestor entered the statue and radiated mana, the invisible, potent force that governed everything from crop fertility to political legitimacy. The air around a newly awakened Moai must have felt electric, as if the wind itself was suddenly paying attention. From that moment on, it wasn't just stone watching you. It was family, eternity, and cosmic accountability combined. The eyes faced inland for a reason. The ancestors weren't guarding against invaders from the sea. There were none. They were watching over the villages, the fields, the children playing near the hearth. Their gaze ensured that rituals were kept, boundaries respected, and hierarchies obeyed. It's one thing to disappoint your parents. It's another to disappoint a 6-meter ancestor made of volcanic tuff. Once awakened, the Moai's eyes were rarely seen again. They were inserted only during ceremonies and sometimes removed afterward, perhaps to rest the spirits or to protect them from misuse. The fragments archaeologists later found scattered around the Ahu shards of coral and obsidian were the remains of these moments, the residue of resurrection. It's hard not to think of it as theater, sacred high-stakes theater. The audience was the entire island, and the actors were the dead. The Moai turned the coastline into a living gallery of surveillance and blessing, a panoramic lineup of authority that made sure everyone remembered their place. Even the wind, people said, shifted when the eyes looked out. And yet, there's something heartbreakingly human in that ritual, this need to make sure the past still cares. The Rapa Nui didn't build the Moai out of arrogance. They built them out of fear of being forgotten. Each one was a prayer cast in basalt, an insistence that memory could be material. The eyes were insurance against oblivion. But eyes are double-edged things. They give life, but they also witness. And when the island's balance began to crumble, when crops failed, when hunger crept in, when clans turned on one another, those same watching eyes became unbearable. To live under the gaze of your ancestors while starving was its own kind of judgment. The Moai that once blessed the land began to feel like accusers. It wouldn't be long before some of those eyes were shattered, and others forced to stare at the ground. Faith, when cornered by survival, tends to look away. At first, no one dared touch them. The Moai was still sacred, still bound by fear and custom. Even when the fields failed and the last tree fell, people whispered to the statues rather than blamed them. But hunger has a way of eroding reverence. Eventually, someone somewhere decided that silence wasn't divine anymore. It was mockery. The Hurimoye, the age of toppling statues, didn't begin with a proclamation. It began with a push. One clan against another. One act of vengeance disguised as revolution. To knock over a rival's Moai wasn't just desecration, it was political theater. You weren't just humiliating your enemies, you were humiliating their ancestors, cutting the cord between their lineage and the gods. Every crash of stone against soil was both protest and punctuation. Archaeologists still find them where they fell. Face first, necks snapped, eyes shattered. They're not victims of time or weather. They're victims of disillusionment. Some toppled in battles between starving factions. Others were likely pulled down deliberately, their mana drained, their protection revoked. You can almost imagine the sound, a deep, final exhale from the earth as 1,000 years of devotion tipped into the dust. But this wasn't chaos for chaos' sake. It was survival reasserting itself. The old religion had failed to feed anyone. The priest's chants no longer brought rain, and the ancestors, those once benevolent guardians, now loomed as reminders of wasted strength. In a world shrinking by the day, it made more sense to topple the past than to worship it. And yet, the irony is unbearable. These same people who brought down their gods had once risked their lives to raise them. The same hands that had polished the stone faces with reverence now tied ropes around their necks. The act must have felt both sacrilegious and satisfying, a quiet vengeance against impossible expectations. Faith hadn't vanished, it had inverted. When European explorers arrived in the 18th century, almost every moai was already down. They thought earthquakes had done it, or that the statues had been knocked over accidentally. But the truth was much more human. The islanders themselves had ended the age of stone, not out of ignorance, but out of clarity. They'd realized that worshipping the dead was less useful than feeding the living. Still, they didn't stop believing altogether. They simply changed the rules. The ancestors had failed. Now the living would have to make new gods out of what still moved the sky, the sea, and, eventually, the birds. Because even when civilizations burn through their miracles, they never run out of imagination. From the ruins of the moai rose another faith, lighter and more pragmatic, one that traded permanence for renewal, endurance for flight. The world had fallen silent, but soon the cliffs would echo again, this time with wings and shouts, and the annual frenzy of a competition where survival wore feathers instead of stone. When the gods of stone lost their voices, the people of Rapa Nui looked up and found new ones in the sky. Every spring, the sooty terns returned to the cliffs, shrieking over the waves, nesting on the offshore islets. They came like clockwork, unfazed by famine, clan wars, or divine unemployment. While the moai stared inland, blind and toppled, the birds kept coming back. Renewal had wings. Out of that dependable miracle grew a new faith, the Tangata Manu, the Birdman cult. If the moai had been monuments to permanence, this was a religion of motion, cyclical, risky, and alive. Instead of carving ancestors, men now competed to embody them. Each year, the chiefs and their champions gathered at Orongo, a stone village perched on the lip of the Rano Cow crater, its walls etched with birdmen and deities. From there, they watched the sea and waited for the terns to nest. The ritual was breathtaking in both beauty and absurdity. Once the birds arrived, each chief's chosen representative, a servant, not the chief himself, climbed down the sheer cliff, swam through shark-infested water, and scrambled onto the jagged islet of Moto Nui. There he waited, often for days, until the first egg was laid. Whoever brought back that egg intact, tied in a cloth around his forehead, made his master the new Birdman, the island's divine ruler for a year. It was a contest of endurance, courage, and luck, with a prize that combined politics and theology into one fragile shell. The Birdman didn't just rule. He embodied fertility itself. He was both man and god, both symbol and scapegoat. For 1 year, he lived in seclusion, anointed and feared, his body daubed in sacred ochre, his head shaved, his humanity on pause. Then the cycle began again. The old ruler stepped down, the birds returned, and the ocean renewed its part in the ritual. Eternity rebuilt itself, one egg at a time. It was genius, really an ecological religion for a deforested island. The people no longer worshipped what was gone, they worshipped what still came back. The moai had been monuments to memory. The Birdman cult was a promise of continuity. And in that shift, you can almost feel the psychology of survival at work. A culture rewriting its myths fast enough to stay alive. Archaeologists would later find Orongo's stone houses still clinging to the crater rim, their interiors covered in petroglyphs of Makemake, the bird-headed creator god, and hybrid figures, part human, part gull. It's as if the people had reimagined themselves mid-flight, redefining divinity in the language of wings. The statues had failed to move. The birds never stopped. The Birdman era lasted until the missionaries arrived and decided that cliff diving for holiness was a branding issue. But for centuries, it worked, a religion perfectly calibrated to scarcity, a living negotiation between fear and renewal. And when even that faith faded, replaced by crosses and fences, something of the birds remained, in art, in story, in the quiet conviction that rebirth was still possible, even on an island that had already run out of trees. When the ships finally appeared on the horizon, the Rapa Nui had already told their story. The moai lay scattered, their faces turned toward the earth. The birds still circled the cliffs. But the Europeans arrived with that peculiar blend of curiosity and arrogance that always confuses silence for invitation. They called it discovery, as if the island hadn't been busy living for 8 centuries without them. They were baffled, of course. Giant stone heads in the middle of nowhere, who could resist projecting a mystery onto that? They asked the wrong questions with the confidence of people who assumed they were the first to ask any. Who built them? How did they move them? Where did they all go? The answers, sitting quietly in oral histories and half-erased rituals, were lost in translation or ignored. It was easier to imagine a vanished race than to believe that Polynesian farmers with stone tools had out-engineered physics. Western imagination went to work. Theories bloomed like invasive species. The Moai were aliens, or Atlanteans, or survivors of a lost continent. Anything but what they really were. Proof that humans, when isolated long enough with faith and ego, can sculpt eternity out of loneliness. Each new explorer renamed the island in their own tongue, sketching, measuring, looting. The Rapa Nui, who had spent centuries in conversation with their ancestors, were reduced to footnotes in their own myth. By the 20th century, archaeologists finally began to listen, not just to the stones, but to the descendants. They realized the Moai weren't heads at all, but full bodies buried up to their shoulders by time. They discovered the roads carved into the earth, the quarries filled with unfinished giants, the coral eyes that once gave the statues sight. Bit by bit, the myth of mystery unraveled, revealing something far more astonishing, a complete, self-contained world built on memory and belief. But even as science untangled the past, tourism retold it. Today, the Moai stand again, resurrected by restoration teams, surrounded by cameras and sunscreen. Tourists pose beside them, grinning, unaware that they're standing on tombs. Drones hum where chants once rose. The statues have become famous again, not as ancestors, but as icons, stripped of function, immortal through misunderstanding. And yet, even through centuries of misinterpretation, they endure. The Rapa Nui still live on the island, speaking their language, teaching their history, guarding their heritage. They no longer carve Moai, but the instinct behind them, the need to remember, to make something last, never left. The Moai are no longer about gods or competition. They are, at last, about survival. So when the wind moves through Rano Raraku today, it hums over the same half-finished faces, the same tools lying in the dust. It sounds almost like breathing, as if the island itself is exhaling after centuries of holding its story in. The mystery of Easter Island was never how the statues were built. It was how the people who built them refused to disappear. Stone, after all, was never meant to last forever. Memory was There's a point in the Pacific Ocean so far from anywhere that even the wind seems to lose its way. It's a patch of volcanic earth, the shape of a triangle, just 24 kilometers across, floating in a sea so vast it feels hypothetical. On maps it's called Rapa Nui, though outsiders later renamed it Easter Island, as if a date on a Christian calendar could somehow own it. When the first Polynesian voyagers arrived, sometime between 1200 and 1250 CE, the place must have looked like a small miracle. Lush palms swayed over black cliffs, seabirds nested in thousands, and the soil rich, volcanic, generous, was exactly what a people from the ocean dreamed of finding. They'd crossed more than 2,000 kilometers of open water in double-hulled canoes, guided only by stars, swells, and memory. To reach Rapa Nui was to win the world's cruelest lottery, an act of navigation so precise that modern sailors still call it improbable. They brought with them everything civilization needed to begin again. Crops like taro, yam, banana, and sweet potato, chickens for meat, stone tools, and that old Polynesian talent for turning the unforgiving into the familiar. They built gardens from volcanic ash, dug pits to trap moisture, and slowly bent the island to their rhythm. The first generations must have believed they'd found eternity, an eternal green bubble where storms were rare, fish were plentiful, and the horizon never changed. The island rewarded them for their faith. Palms rose 100 feet tall, with trunks perfect for canoes and fronds broad enough to thatch roofs for decades. Beneath them, the forest teemed with seabirds, so many that people could gather eggs by the hundreds. The air smelled of salt and soil. The nights were warm enough for stories, the kind told in the hush between waves when the ancestors are said to lean in and listen. Isolation has a way of heightening imagination. With no neighbors to trade with, no wars to fight, and no horizon left to chase, the Rapa Nui turned their gaze inward. Their world shrank until the island became the entire universe, its mountains, its craters, its cliffs, each one a place of myth and omen. The land itself became a living ancestor, and its guardians began to take shape, not in flesh, but in stone. It's easy now, centuries later, to think of Rapa Nui as a warning, an ecological parable about ambition gone wrong. But for a long time, it was a triumph. The population grew, fields expanded, villages flourished. The forest was cut carefully, not greedily, each tree taken with ceremony. They weren't reckless, not yet. The balance between use and reverence still held, thin but intact. And then came that peculiar human impulse that always arrives after plenty, the urge to prove devotion through excess. The island had gods, ancestors, and enough stone to shape their faces. And so began the slow, steady transformation of paradise into monument, when people started carving immortality out of volcanic cliffs, confident that eternity would never send them the bill. It began with the dead. Not in the morbid way, more in the practical, deeply Polynesian sense that the dead never really went anywhere. They just changed jobs. The ancestors of Rapa Nui weren't silent memories. They were active participants in daily life, guardians, witnesses, moral accountants, and somewhere between gratitude and fear, a new religion took shape, one where the past had a face, and that face was carved from stone. Every society eventually decides what divinity should look like, and Rapa Nui chose lineage. The chiefs claimed descent from the gods themselves, a bloodline as sacred as the soil. Authority wasn't inherited. It was performed, built in the open, displayed on cliffs, and chiseled into permanence. The Ariki, the high chiefs, ruled by controlling the mana, that invisible power connecting the living to the spirits. The stronger your mana, the more stable the world seemed to be. Rain fell when it should. Fish returned to the shore. The soil yielded without complaint. In that sense, politics and the weather were the same department. To manifest this power, they built ahu, long stone platforms that were part temple, part tomb, part stage. On these, the ancestors would rise again, sculpted as moai, enormous stone figures, eyes blank, lips pressed tight in an expression that somehow managed to combine grace, pride, and quiet warning. They faced inland, not outward. They weren't guarding the island from the sea. They were watching the living, making sure promises were kept. It was a religion of vigilance. The ancestors saw everything, the planting, the fishing, the quarrels, the hoarding. Their gaze kept balance, but it also ensured obedience. The moai didn't threaten punishment, exactly. They threatened disappointment, which is often worse. Imagine farming under the stare of your entire genealogy. It keeps a person industrious. But mana wasn't evenly distributed. Each clan had its own sacred lineage, its own moai, and its own priests interpreting divine moods. The bigger the statue, the greater the clan's prestige. What began as reverence slowly became rivalry, the kind of spiritual competition that looks holy on the surface but feels suspiciously like a construction contest underneath. By linking status to the ancestors, the Rapa Nui found a brilliant way to organize themselves, and a terrible way to test sustainability, because devotion, once tied to monument building, never really ends. Each generation had to prove its faith anew, and nothing says devotion like another 10 meters of carved divinity. Still, at this stage, it worked. The island pulsed with purpose. Ceremonies filled the air with chanting and conch horns. The smell of earth and fire mixed with salt wind. The people didn't feel doomed, they felt chosen. Their gods were tangible, their dead cooperative, their leaders divine. And the moai, those silent, watchful giants, stood as the perfect proof that faith could be engineered into geology. Of course, once you start measuring belief in tons of stone, the numbers never stop climbing. The quarries would soon echo day and night, and the island's hills would turn into factories of eternity. What began as prayer would evolve into industry, and industry, on a small island, is just another word for hunger deferred. At Rano-Raraku, the quarry that fed both faith and ego, the mountainside looked like it had caught religion mid-sentence. Hundreds of moai lay half-carved in the rock, their faces emerging as if the volcano itself were exhaling ancestors. The place must have sounded alive, the dull rhythm of basalt adzes tapping tough, the chant of workers sinking muscle to prayer, the wind carrying volcanic dust that settled on their skin like pale ash. Here, divinity was manufactured, one chisel mark at a time. Each statue began as an idea commissioned by a chief, an ancestor to honor, a lineage to advertise. The carvers, organized in hereditary guilds, shaped the body flat against the cliff, freeing it only when the front was complete. Then came the delicate process of cutting the back, sliding the statue down the slope, and sending it toward its ahu, its sacred platform. Some figures were small enough to move without catastrophe. Others were so enormous they defied even myth, towering 10 meters and weighing more than a commercial airliner. You can still see the ones that never made it out, the victims of ambition or geology, depending on your perspective. But this wasn't mindless labor, it was choreography with a theological beat. As each moai was carved, the community fed the carvers, sang for the ancestors, and kept fires burning to light their progress. Children carried water, women prepared food, priests offered prayers. The entire island became an engine of piety. Religion, economics, and family all pulsed in unison, driven by the conviction that the next statue might finally make the gods notice. Of course, not all ancestors are equally charismatic. Clans competed to outshine one another, measuring prestige in sheer tonnage of stone. One lineage raised a statue taller, another responded with one heavier, and soon devotion began to look suspiciously like escalation. Faith became geometry, and geometry demanded trees for ropes, rollers, and sledges. The forest groaned but obeyed. There's a point in every civilization where craftsmanship becomes addiction. On Rapa Nui, that point was carved into stone. The island's population swelled, its resources stretched, and yet no one thought to stop. To stop carving would have meant the ancestors were satisfied, and satisfied ancestors are lazy ancestors. Better to keep them busy. From the crater, the moai began their solemn migration across the island. Teams of hundreds dragged them over hills and through fields, chanting as they went, believing the statues were walking themselves through the power of mana. It must have been a breathtaking sight, a procession of gods swaying forward like drunk saints, their blank eyes fixed on the horizon. Each successful journey became legend, each broken statue a cautionary tale. And when the statue finally reached its platform and rose upright, the island paused. The chief stood before it, the priests murmured, the crowd bowed. Another ancestor had returned, another claim to divinity secured. The island glittered with new silhouettes, each one staring inland, each one a promise. But promises, especially divine ones, demand upkeep. The more statues that rose, the more mouths needed feeding, the more trees were felled, the more energy was poured into keeping a heaven that refused to pay rent. For a while, though, it still looked magnificent, a ring of giants watching over a people certain their gods were pleased. It wouldn't stay magnificent for long. You can only keep sculpting eternity until the trees are gone. The ropes fray, and the ancestors start feeling heavier than the faith that built them. At first, no one noticed the silence. The forests had thinned so gradually that memory adjusted, the way eyes adjust to darkness. The great palms that once towered over Rapa Nui disappeared one by one, turned into rope, firewood, and myth. People said they'd return. Trees always do. But the seedlings never made it past the rats. Those uninvited stowaways from the first canoes, who found palm nuts irresistible. By the time someone realized the forest wouldn't grow back, it was already a legend. The island that had once been a green jewel turned naked under the sun. Without trees, the wind stripped the topsoil from gardens, and the rains washed what remained into the sea. Fields that once grew taro and yams shrank to stubborn patches of stunted crops. The birds that had once nested in the palms vanished, leaving only echoes. Even the ocean seemed to retreat. Without wood for canoes, deep-sea fishing became impossible. The islanders were now prisoners of their own horizon, but the moai still rose. Faith, after all, doesn't respond well to statistics. The chiefs called for more rituals, the priests for greater devotion, the workers for larger meals that no longer existed, and somehow, against every law of sustainability, the statues kept getting bigger. The quarries still sang with chisels, and people still hauled stone across the deforested plains, dragging their ancestors through dust that used to be shade. Archaeologists call it ecological overshoot, which is an elegant way of saying we didn't stop when we should have. But the truth is less dramatic and more human. The Rapa Nui weren't suicidal, they were faithful. Their worldview had no concept of running out of world. The land was sacred, yes, but also obedient. It had always provided. Why would the ancestors allow otherwise? Still, hunger has a way of questioning theology. People began to build monavai, circular rock gardens that trapped moisture and protected fragile crops. They grew sweet potatoes in stone mulch and raised chickens in stone pens. Ingenious, yes, but ultimately desperate. You can't innovate your way out of an island that's smaller every year. The old rituals began to feel heavier, the statues less like protectors and more like burdens. What had once been spiritual currency became debt. The more the land struggled, the more the priests demanded sacrifices, food, labor, obedience. The ancestors, it seemed, had expensive taste, and still, no one dared to abandon the moai. The statues were the link between past and present, gods and mortals, meaning and chaos. To stop building them would mean accepting that the island had limits, and humans rarely take that kind of news gracefully. So they kept carving, kept hauling, kept praying for the forest to grow back. It didn't. The island's silence deepened until it became almost physical, a quiet that pressed against the skin. And from that quiet, something else began to stir. Resentment. When the world stops answering, even gods can start to look suspicious. It's never one catastrophe that breaks a civilization. It's the slow, unbearable realization that the rules no longer work. The chants still sounded the same. The priests still waved their sacred staffs. But the rains came late, and the harvests came thin. The ancestors, once generous and punctual, had gone quiet. The moai still stood, solemn as ever, but their silence began to feel accusatory. You could almost sense the island shifting from reverence to suspicion. Clans that had once competed through sculpture now competed for survival. The old rituals that bound them together began to unravel under pressure. With forests gone and soil eroding, trade between regions faltered. Canoes were too fragile for long voyages. Food storage became uncertain. The fine balance between belief and necessity started to tip, and when belief wobbles, politics is never far behind. The Ariki, the sacred chiefs, tried to hold authority together with ceremony. They called for more feasts, more offerings, more prayers, as if repetition could coax divinity out of hiding. But the priests' promises were starting to sound like excuses. The people listened, hungry, skeptical. When crops failed, the blame fell on rival clans, on weak chiefs, on anyone whose moai seemed less convincing than the rest. The sacred hierarchy that had once stabilized the island now turned brittle, cracking under the weight of unmet expectations. It must have been a strange kind of disillusionment, not anger exactly, but a slow unlearning of awe. The moai that once radiated protection now looked indifferent. Some clans accused others of hoarding resources, or worse, hoarding mana, that invisible spiritual power said to maintain cosmic order. When your stomach's empty, metaphysics becomes personal. Archaeological evidence suggests the construction frenzy slowed, then stopped. The half-carved figures at Rano Raraku were simply abandoned where they lay, as if the island's collective will had evaporated mid-hammer strike. The quarries fell silent. The sacred roads, once polished smooth by sledges and bare feet, began to erode. And yet, the moai already standing remained upright, unblinking, a frozen pantheon of promises too big to take down, at least for now. The human response to crisis is remarkably predictable. Double down, blame others, improvise rituals, and when all else fails, pick up a weapon. As famine deepened, some clans fortified their villages, others took to raiding. Stone tools were reshaped into spearheads. The oral histories remembered these years not as apocalypse, but as huri moai, the time when balance turned upside down. Faith fractured along with the soil. People still believed in mana, but now they argued over who had lost it or stolen it. The divine no longer guaranteed fairness. It had become something to compete for, like food. The gods, if they still listened, must have sounded amused. And when belief can't hold, it collapses theatrically. The first toppled statue fell not because of atheism, but because of exhaustion, a final, angry punctuation mark carved in stone. The Moai would soon become victims of the same devotion that raised them. They didn't all fall at once. Collapse, like erosion, prefers slow drama. At first, it was just a few statues toppled during skirmishes. Maybe an accident, maybe a message. But soon, the ground itself began collecting gods face down. Their coral eyes shattered, their necks split from impact. The island that had once raised its dead now buried them again, only this time without ceremony. The Huri Moai period, literally, the overturning of the statues, was less an event than a reckoning. Each clan, angry or starving or both, took down the ancestors of their rivals. If your enemies Moai had once blessed their gardens, toppling it was the closest thing to divine sabotage. A fallen statue wasn't just stone on dirt. It was a broken contract with heaven, and once that first taboo was crossed, restraint became impossible. Archaeologists can still trace the aftermath like crime scene evidence: broken platforms, smashed coral eyes, burnt offerings abandoned mid-ritual. The Moai didn't decay, they were executed. The spiritual hierarchy that had defined the island for centuries collapsed in a matter of decades, replaced by something far more pragmatic: survival. But it wasn't mindless destruction. There's a strange precision in how the statues were toppled, pulled from behind, carefully tipped forward so they landed face first. It's as if even rebellion had to respect the choreography of faith. The people didn't stop believing in power. They just decided it was time to redistribute it. The quarries fell silent. The great carving pits at Rano Roraku turned into ghost villages of unfinished gods, some still attached to the bedrock, others half-freed, as if struggling to escape. These abandoned statues, still lying where they fell centuries ago, look less like ruins and more like sleepwalkers frozen mid-dream. Social order followed the statues down. Chiefs lost authority, priests lost credibility, and warfare became both political and personal. With food scarce, cannibalism emerged, not as savagery, but as punctuation. In oral traditions, they don't dwell on it. It's mentioned like weather, one more consequence of living inside a world that had shrunk to the limits of its own mistakes. Yet, in a way, the island was still performing its oldest ritual: transformation. The people who had once spent centuries raising gods from stone were now turning those gods back into earth. The Moai had stood for stability, continuity, and divine justice, ideas that were suddenly impossible luxuries. And so the ancestors were laid down, like exhausted witnesses to human persistence. Still, the Rapa Nui didn't stop creating meaning. Even as the old religion died, a new one was forming, restless and pragmatic. When the statues fell silent, the people looked up and found their next miracle circling in the sky. Out of the wreckage of gods, something winged emerged. After the Moai fell and the ancestral cult collapsed under its own weight, the Rapa Nui did what humans always do when belief runs out of furniture. They rearranged the room, and so began the Tangata Manu, the Birdman era. A new religion built not from stone, but from timing, competition, and feathers. It was born at Orongo, a cliffside village carved into the rim of the Rano Cow crater, where the world feels tilted between sea and sky. Here, on the edge of what was left, the people built small, round stone houses and covered their walls with petroglyphs of bird-headed men, part human, part sacred gold. Below them lay the islets of Motonui and Moto Aiti, where each spring the sooty terns came to nest. The birds never failed to return, no matter how the people suffered. That kind of reliability felt divine. The old gods had stopped answering. The ancestors, turned face down in the dirt, no longer offered protection. But the terns, silent, tireless, predictable, still brought renewal. And so, the island remade its theology around what was left. Instead of permanence, it worshipped recurrence. Instead of stone, it trusted wings. Every year, a ritual competition began. Each clan chose a champion, usually a servant or warrior, who would climb down the near-vertical cliff of Orongo, swim through shark-filled surf, and wait for the first tern to lay its egg on Motonui. Days passed under the beating sun, foodless, sleepless, waiting for that fragile symbol of life. The man who found it tied the egg to his forehead and swam back intact, won the island's highest honor, not for himself, but for his chief. That chief became the Birdman, the living link between humanity and creation. ruler for a single year. It was religion as survival strategy, elegant, brutal, cyclical. The Birdman didn't build temples or raise statues. He embodied fertility, abundance, and the promise that life could still restart. After his coronation, he lived in seclusion, anointed in red ochre, head shaved, fed by attendants, sacred but untouchable. When his year ended, so did his divinity. The power returned to the cliffs, to the sea, to the birds. It was a system that left no room for permanence, and maybe that was the point. Where the Moai had faced inland, demanding loyalty, the Birdman looked outward, chasing a miracle that always flew away. Faith became motion, a game of endurance and luck, and somehow it worked. The island, stripped bare of trees and gods, found a rhythm again, modest, adaptive, alive. Archaeologists still trace the outlines of Orongo's houses and the carvings of bird-headed men etched into stone. They marked the moment. Rapa Nui shifted from obsession to acceptance, from trying to control the world to learning how to survive it. It was almost peaceful, that new religion, until, of course, the horizon changed shape again, sails on the sea, foreign faces, and the kind of curiosity that always begins with admiration and ends with ownership. The first ship must have looked like a hallucination, a moving mountain with wings cutting across the horizon. For centuries, Rapa Nui had been an island that spoke only to itself, its myths perfectly sealed within its borders. Then, on Easter Sunday of 1722, a Dutch explorer named Jacob Roggeveen arrived, carrying with him the usual gifts of civilization: confusion, smallpox, and a chronic inability to listen. He wrote of giant statues and naked savages, which tells you everything about European field notes at the time. His men fired their muskets during what was supposed to be a friendly encounter, killing a dozen islanders before lunch. By evening, the discovery was complete. Another paradise successfully frightened into submission. Roggeveen stayed a week, took some sketches, renamed the island after the Christian calendar, and sailed away, leaving behind a story no one had asked him to tell. More ships followed, Spanish, British, French, each one arriving as though the island had been waiting for them. They marveled at the Moai, now mostly toppled, and concluded that such grandeur couldn't possibly have been made by the same people standing before them. It was the beginning of that enduring Western reflex: if something looks impressive, assume a lost race built it. The Rapa Nui were reclassified from engineers to caretakers of someone else's genius. Then came the real disasters. In the 1860s, Peruvian slave traders raided the island, capturing or killing nearly half the population. Chiefs, priests, and artisans, the keepers of oral tradition, were marched onto ships and never returned. Those few who did brought back smallpox, which finished what slavery began. By 1877, barely 110 islanders remained alive. The Moai, once the physical embodiment of the ancestors, now watched over an island almost empty of descendants. When Catholic missionaries arrived soon after, they found no shortage of converts. Faith, at that point, was the only renewable resource. The Birdman cult was declared heresy. Its carvings were defaced or buried. The island's memory was rewritten in Latin hymns and European discipline. Rapa Nui became less a homeland and more a laboratory for religion, ranching, and anthropological curiosity. Chile annexed it in 1888. Leasing almost the entire island to a sheep company that fenced off the land and confined the surviving Rapa Nui to a single village, Hangaroa. For decades, they weren't allowed to leave without permission. Their ancestors had once crossed oceans guided by stars. Now they needed written authorization to walk across their own island, and yet, even then, they endured. They kept the old stories alive in whispers, in chants disguised as hymns, in dances that looked like entertainment but were really remembrance. The world had come to study them, to photograph them, to pity them, but not to understand them. Rapa Nui had turned from a living civilization into a mystery exhibit. Still, mysteries have a way of surviving curiosity. The island waited, its silence thicker than before, its statues patient as ever. The foreigners would come and go. The Moai, after all, had seen worse. By the time the 20th century arrived, Rapa Nui was no longer a place, it was a question. Western explorers, archaeologists, and dreamers all arrived carrying the same assumption, that the island couldn't possibly have built itself. The Moai stood too tall, the feats too precise, the collapse too dramatic. So began the myth-making part, scholarship, part fantasy, and entirely projection. The first visitors saw ruins and decided they must belong to a lost civilization, one grander than the primitive descendants left behind. Some claimed South Americans must have sailed across to teach the islanders architecture. Others blamed aliens because apparently it's easier to imagine extraterrestrials doing the work than brown-skinned farmers with basalt chisels. What was really a story of survival, faith, and ecological exhaustion became a bedtime story about hubris and mystery. The narrative was tidy, seductive, moralizing. They destroyed themselves. People said, a warning whispered to industrial societies that preferred parables to nuance. It was perfect propaganda for the age of guilt. You could look at Rapa Nui and see your own anxieties reflected. Overpopulation, deforestation, collapse. The island became a mirror for everyone except the people who actually lived there. Meanwhile, archaeologists began peeling back the legend with the patience of surgeons. They uncovered the quarries at Rano Raraku, still littered with unfinished moai, and realized the figures weren't just heads, but entire bodies buried by centuries of erosion. They traced the roads carved into the volcanic earth, confirming the statues had been moved upright, not dragged. They found stone gardens, ingenious systems of moisture retention that delayed famine far longer than anyone had imagined. The Rapa Nui hadn't collapsed overnight. They had adapted until they couldn't. But history, like tourism, rewards simplicity, and mystery sells better than complex human story. Magazines printed grainy photos of half-buried heads under headlines like The Lost Race of Easter Island. And who built the giants? No one asked the descendants who, inconveniently, still spoke the language and knew the names of their ancestors. The islanders became extras in their own legend, their heritage translated into English narration and souvenir postcards. Even Thor Heyerdahl, the famous adventurer who built rafts to prove ancient sea travel, couldn't resist the island's theatrical despair. In the 1950s he claimed the moai were evidence of South American migration. He staged experiments to make statues walk, unintentionally confirming what Rapa Nui oral history had already said for centuries. The island didn't need saving, it needed listening. And slowly, through archaeology and the persistence of its people, the truth re-emerged. The mystery wasn't a riddle to be solved. It was a misunderstanding to be undone. The moai weren't relics of failure. They were survivors of meaning, weathered but still watching. Yet even now, mystery lingers like fog over the island. Tourists still whisper about aliens and lost worlds, as if refusing to accept the simpler, stranger truth that ordinary humans, armed only with conviction, built gods out of stone and then lived long enough to regret it. And maybe that's what draws the world back. Not the statues, but the uncomfortable familiarity of their story. Because what happened on Rapa Nui wasn't an exception to humanity, it was a rehearsal. In the end, Rapa Nui's story isn't really about mystery or collapse. It's about proportion, how belief can grow larger than the landscape that feeds it. The moai still stand, weathered and patient, not as symbols of failure but of scale. How far devotion will stretch before the ground beneath it gives way. Archaeologists now know the island's people didn't vanish. They adapted, restructured, reinvented. They survived slavery, smallpox, colonial fences, and centuries of misinterpretation. Their descendants still live on the same volcanic soil, still speak their ancestral tongue, still celebrate Tapati Rapa Nui, a festival that honors both heritage and survival. For a civilization that's supposedly lost, it's doing suspiciously well. Modern studies paint a different picture from the collapse myth. The deforestation wasn't just carelessness, it was entangled in ecology, rats, and resource strain. The decline wasn't a sudden apocalypse, but a slow rearrangement of life, a change in faith, economy, and rhythm. The Rapa Nui didn't destroy themselves, they endured in smaller, humbler forms. It was the outside world that nearly erased them. Even the statues themselves, once thought to face the sea as sentinels, now reveal something more intimate. Most moai look inland, toward the villages they protected. They weren't warnings, they were guardians. Each one marked, not conquest, but kinship, a stone memory of the living watching over the living. When scientists analyzed the soil around the platforms, they found evidence of careful gardening, nutrients, and irrigation channels. The moai weren't monuments to excess. They were part of a sustainable system, sacred agriculture, belief and biology intertwined. The real tragedy wasn't spiritual collapse. it was historical translation. Europeans arrived with diseases, guns, and the kind of certainty that mistakes difference for deficiency. They took an island that had already reinvented itself and told it what its past meant. Rapa Nui became a moral fable for outsiders. Look what happens when humans overreach. Convenient, tidy, and utterly wrong. But the statues remain, outlasting every interpretation. Their faces are smooth now, their features eroded by salt and rain. Yet they still stand on their platforms, eyes hollow but unyielding, as if silently judging every tourist selfie and academic thesis. They've watched centuries of misunderstanding drift past like clouds. The truth is quieter than legend. The Moai aren't mysteries. They're reminders, not of a fall, but of endurance, that peculiar, stubborn human tendency to keep building meaning even when the world has stopped making sense. And maybe that's why Rapa Nui haunts us. Because somewhere between the forests that fell and the gods that wouldn't answer, we see ourselves carving greatness from the land that feeds us, praying it'll last longer than our memory. The island never really vanished. It simply went silent, waiting for the world to learn the difference between discovery and listening.